Have you ever had a job so bad you thought it can't get worse than this? Well, imagine cleaning human waste by hand or turning a spit for 12 hours beside a fire as a child. Welcome to the brutal world of medieval employment. The pay was awful, the danger was real, and quitting wasn't exactly an option. In this video, we're diving deep into the absolute worst jobs people had in the Middle Ages. From the disgusting to the downright deadly, you might never complain about your 9 to 5 again. But hey, before you get too comfortable, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop your city name and local time in the comments, so we know exactly where in the world you're watching us from. Let's set the scene. It's midnight in a filthy rat-infested alley behind a medieval tavern. The streets are quiet. The only sounds are the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer and the soft slosh of human waste being dumped into a wooden bucket. Who's the poor soul collecting it? That is a gong farmer. And if you think your job sucks, imagine spending your nights waist deep in medieval sewage. Welcome to one of the absolute worst jobs in history. Gong farmers, also known as night soil men, were the medieval world's unsung and often unsmelled heroes. Their job was to clean out the cesspits beneath latrines, privies, and public toilets, which were basically holes in the ground filled with centuries of human waste. The word gong doesn't come from a musical instrument. It comes from the Old English word gang, meaning to go. Yes, that kind of go. So a gong farmer was literally someone who dealt with human going. Most cities and towns had cesspits, deep, brick-lined holes that sat beneath latrines and collected everything flushed down by gravity and prayer. These pits didn't magically empty themselves, so when they got full, it was time to call in the brave souls who crawled into the stink and dug it out. They didn't get fancy tools or protective suits. They got buckets, wooden ones, maybe a shovel if they were lucky, and a torch so they could actually see what they were shoveling. What could go wrong with an open flame next to methane gas? Plenty. Gong farmers usually worked at night, not because it was romantic, but because no one wanted to see or smell them during the day. Cities like London would find them if they worked in daylight, so they'd go from house to house and tavern to tavern, hauling out sludge and hauling in nightmares. Once those buckets were full, they had to be carted out of the city and dumped in designated dumping grounds called laystals or fields on the outskirts. Sometimes the waste was sold to farmers as fertilizer, but even the most desperate farmer would turn his nose up at the really ripe stuff. Now you might think this job was unpaid or only for criminals. Shockingly, gong farmers could make decent money, at least by medieval standards. They were paid well because no one else wanted to do it. But before you picture them retiring in a manor house, keep in mind the cost: disease, constant ridicule, and the smell. The smell stuck to their clothes, their skin, and their hair. Some were even banned from parts of town due to their aroma. They became walking public health warnings. Speaking of health, let's not forget the diseases they risked every single night: leptospirosis, dysentery, typhoid, and tetanus, just for fun. And the occasional rat bite? That's right, rats loved cesspits. Big ones. Some even swam. Imagine reaching into a pit in the dark and feeling something squish back or worse. Bite. One infamous report from the 14th century tells the story of a gong farmer who fell into a pit while working and suffocated before anyone could pull him out. Another was burned alive when his torch ignited a pocket of methane gas. There were no safety rules, no hazard pay, just a man, a bucket, and the hope that he wouldn't die face down in medieval sludge. Despite being essential, gong farmers were treated with disgusted pity. They were only allowed to live in certain parts of the city, usually near the dumping grounds or riverbanks. Their families were socially isolated. Their kids were teased marriage. Let's just say if a gong farmer found love, it probably started with "I can't smell anything anymore," and ended with, "Well, at least he brings home decent money." But here's the strange part. As disgusting as the job was, society depended on gong farmers. Without them, Medieval towns would have become unlivable. Disease would spread faster, streets would flood with waste, and nobles wouldn't be able to throw feasts without ending up elbow deep in their own leftovers. The rich and the poor needed someone to do the dirty work, and the Gong farmer answered the call, literally the call of nature. Job was so vital that cities sometimes gave Gong farmers official licenses and even protective laws, not to keep them safe, but to make sure no one got in their way. In London, they were regulated under the wardens of the cleanliness of the city. Fancy name, same old stink historical. Records even show that Gong farmers sometimes went on strike. They refused to clean cesspits until they were paid more. A bold move, especially in a time when being an essential worker often meant being replaceable. But when the Gong farmers didn't show up, entire neighborhoods shut down. Towns usually gave in, because when your streets are ankle deep in filth, the guy with the bucket suddenly becomes very important. So next time you're having a bad day at work, just imagine crawling into a medieval latrine at 2 in the morning, in total darkness, with nothing but a torch, and the hope that you won't drown in a pit of centuries-old filth. No air conditioning, no gloves, just guts, and not always your owning. The end, the Gong farmer had one of the worst jobs in medieval history, but they were quiet champions of public health, the hidden gears of the medieval machine. Gross, absolutely necessary. More than most people realized, heroes in the most disgusting way possible. And with that fragrant introduction, we move on from medieval toilets to something a little sharper. If the idea of wading waist deep through a swamp in the early morning fog, with cold mud sloshing into your boots and dozens of tiny, squirming parasites attaching themselves to your legs, sounds like a nightmare, congratulations, you're picturing the life of a medieval leech collector. While the Gong farmer dealt with human waste, the leech collector worked with blood, and lots of it. Welcome to one of the strangest, slimmiest, and most squeamish professions of the medieval era. Leech collecting was not a job for the faint-hearted or the clot-prone. In medieval medicine, leeches were seen as little miracle workers. Doctors believed illness came from an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And when in doubt, just drain the blood. Literally bleeding a patient was often the go-to solution for anything from headaches to fevers to more serious conditions like pneumonia or even mental illness. And leeches were the perfect little helpers for that. This made leeches a valuable commodity. Apothecaries needed them. Physicians requested them. Barbers, yes, the same ones who gave haircuts, kept jars of them by the chair, and someone had to go out and find them. Enter the leech collector, the medieval version of a biological arms dealer. But instead of bullets and bombs, they dealt in squishy, blood-sucking annelids. The job was deceptively simple. Go into a swamp marsh or slow-moving river and collect as many live leeches as possible. But there was a catch. Actually, several catches. Leeches don't just hang out on lily pads waiting to be picked like berries. No, the best way to attract them, expose your own skin and let them latch on. So, yes, leech collectors, often poor women and children, would hike up their skirts or roll up their trousers, wade barefoot into the cold, dark water, and stand there silently for hours. The goal: wait until enough leeches attach themselves to your legs, then pull them off and store them in jars or clay pots. Some collectors would even cut themselves slightly to speed up the process, giving the leeches an irresistible buffet. The process was dangerous, exhausting, and gross. First off, leeches don't just bite and leave. They latch on with tiny jaws, inject a numbing agent and an anticoagulant, so you don't feel them, and you keep bleeding. Then they suck until they're full, sometimes up to 5 times their body weight. Once they've had enough, they drop off. That's when you had to act fast, scooping them up before they slithered back into the muck. And collecting them wasn't even the worst part. The aftermath was equally terrible. The bleeding from the bites could continue for hours. Some collectors lost dangerous amounts of blood, not from a single leech, But from dozens day after day, infection was a constant risk, especially considering how dirty the water was. Combine that with the physical toll of wading through swamps, the cold, and the occasional wild animal. Ever heard a boar growl at you from the reeds, and you've got a job that was as deadly as it was disgusting. And if you're imagining them in protective gear, though, this was long before rubber boots or gloves. Most collectors worked barefoot, their clothing often rags or hand-me-downs. Got soaked and stained with blood and swamp muck. The smell, a mix of mold, iron, algae, and rot, clung to the skin and wouldn't wash off for days. The most committed collectors would have visible bite scars all over their legs and arms. A horrifying badge of honor despite the misery. There was a market. Leeches were sold to physicians in bulk, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds at a time. They were stored in glass jars or small wooden boxes with damp moss and had to be kept alive between collections. A good haul meant solid payment, especially during plague outbreaks or bad air seasons, when people were desperate to bleed the sickness out of their bodies. But leech collectors were rarely respected. Much like gong farmers, they were part of a system that relied on them, but pretended not to see them. They were dirty, low class, and often viewed with a mix of pity and suspicion. After all, they spent their days luring bloodsuckers. That's not the kind of thing that earns you dinner invitations from noblemen, and let's not forget the moral panic that sometimes followed leech collecting. In some regions, religious leaders questioned the ethics of feeding oneself to beasts for money. Superstitions brewed. Leech collectors were accused of being witches or communing with swamp spirits. In harsh times, this meant banishment, imprisonment, or worse. So not only were these workers bleeding out for the sake of medicine, they also had to fear the wrath of angry villagers and suspicious priests. Ironically, many collectors became sick themselves, standing in cold, stagnant water day after day, sometimes even in winter, led to hypothermia, trench foot, and chronic infections. But stopping wasn't an option for the poor and landless. This was one of the few jobs available. It required no tools, no land, no apprenticeship, just courage, pain tolerance, and a whole lot of luck. By the late medieval period, demand for leeches skyrocketed, especially as medical theories became more sophisticated in some parts of Europe. Leeches were so heavily harvested, they became endangered. This only made the job harder. Collectors had to venture deeper into swamps, further from town, into more dangerous terrain. Some never came back, and then came the competition. Desperate peasants and children trying to collect for themselves. This led to fierce rivalries. Territories were claimed, swamp paths were guarded. If you were a leech collector, you didn't just battle parasites. You also had to fend off fellow humans trying to poach your bog. Still, despite everything, leech collectors played a crucial role in medieval healthcare. Without them, physicians wouldn't have had their most trusted tool. In a world without knowledge of germs or bacteria, bloodletting was seen as life-saving, and collectors, as reluctant as they may have been, kept that system running one leech at a time. So, next time you're dealing with a difficult boss or annoying coworker, imagine waking up at dawn, trudging into freezing water, letting bloodsuckers feast on your flesh, and getting paid just enough to buy stale bread and a rotten apple. It puts things into perspective. Life of a leech collector was cold, wet, bloody, and thankless, but undeniably essential. They were the living bridge between nature's weirdest creatures and humanity's desperation to survive. Disgusting, definitely noble, in a strange, muddy way. Yes, and now, from bleeding in the bog to dodging death on the battlefield, we move on to our next brutal profession. Let's paint a scene together. You're standing on a blood-soaked field at dawn. The air is thick with smoke and the sharp stench of sweat, iron, and death. All around you are groaning men, some clutching their stomachs, others missing limbs. One poor soul is screaming as he tries to hold his intestines in with trembling fingers. Arrows still whistle overhead, and the clang of steel hasn't yet faded. But you You're not a knight, not even a squire. You're the battlefield medic, the medieval version of an surgeon, mortician, and garbage collector, all rolled into one. And you've just clocked in for the worst shift imaginable. While medieval physicians were off debating humors and mixing potions in candlelit chambers, battlefield medics, sometimes called sawbones felchers, or just those poor fools with the knives, were thrown into the bloodbath with nothing more than a blade, a bottle of alcohol, and a prayer. Their job: keep the soldiers alive, or at least make sure they died in slightly less agony. Now here's the thing about medieval medicine. It wasn't very good germ theory. Never heard of it. Sterilization. That's a fancy word from the future. Anesthesia. A strong swig of wine and a stick to bite down on. These were the tools of the trade, and battlefield medics, unlike their university-trained peers, weren't learned scholars. They were usually barbers, apothecaries, or simply men who had survived enough wars to know what a dying man looked like. They worked fast because they had to. On an average medieval battlefield, a medic might be expected to treat dozens, sometimes hundreds of wounded men with no assistance, no tent, and no clean water. The first task: triage, which is a fancy way of saying figure out who can be saved and who's too far gone. If you had a clean arrow wound or a shallow gash, congratulations. You were on the save list. If your head looked like it had met a mace up close, well, best start saying your prayers. Let's talk tools. A medic's kit was horrifyingly simple. A knife, bone saw, forceps, which looked more like blacksmith tongs, cauterizing irons, needle and thread, and maybe a poultice made of herbs and wine-soaked linen. That's it. And the number one procedure: amputation, arrow in the leg, chop it off, sword slash to the arm. Off it goes, crushed foot from a warhorse. Goodbye toes. Amputation was brutal, bloody, and done without anesthesia. The process went like this: hold the patient down, tie a tourniquet above the injury, take a deep breath, and saw fast. You had about 60 seconds before the patient passed out or died from shock. And then came the fire. To stop bleeding and hopefully prevent infection, medics would heat iron rods until they were glowing and press them against the wound. The sound, a sickening sizzle. The smell, burning flesh and hair. The pain. Let's not even go there. If the patient screamed, it was a good sign. It meant they were still alive. Battlefield medics didn't just work during or after the fight. Sometimes they were right behind the front lines, dodging arrows and stepping over corpses to drag injured men to safety. There are records of medics performing amputations in the mud, with bodies piled beside them, blood soaking into the ground. And no idea when the next wave of enemies would arrive. There was no clean space, no scrubbing procedure, just chaos. And after the battle, the real horror began. The medic's job didn't end once the swords stopped swinging. Camps became makeshift. Hospitals filled with the moaning, feverish, and infected. Gangrene was everywhere. Flies swarmed the wounds. Maggots were sometimes seen as a good sign. They ate dead flesh after all. But let's be honest, if maggots are part of your recovery plan, things aren't going great. Infection was the true killer. Even if a soldier survived a battlefield wound, he had a terrifying chance of dying in the days that followed. A dirty knife or cloth could introduce bacteria that led to blood poisoning, tetanus, or a raging fever that fried the brain. And remember, this was a time when doctors thought pus was good. They called it laudable pus, a sign the body was purging the bad spoiler. It was usually just infection, and it usually killed you. Despite all this, battlefield medics were often looked down upon. They weren't educated at fancy universities. They didn't write treatises or get invited to the courts of kings. Instead, they slept on straw, beside their patients soaked in blood and vomit, hands trembling after hours of surgery. They were considered dirty, rough, even barbaric. But they were the ones who got their hands dirty when it counted, who faced the dying and did what had to be done. And it wasn't just soldiers they treated. Camp followers, the cooks, washerwomen, and children who traveled with the army also fell ill or got caught in the chaos. Medics treated them too often with less urgency, but no less effort. It was a never-ending cycle of patching people up only to watch them waste away every now and then. One would gain a reputation, a particularly skilled hand at amputations, or a clever user of herbal remedies. They might be recruited by a noble household, or even knighted for their service, but most died nameless, exhausted and likely from the very infections they tried to cure in others. The mental toll unimaginable. Today, we have names for this PTSD, burnout, moral injury. Back then, you just drank more wine and hoped the screams stopped haunting your dreams. Because if there's one thing medieval medics never had, it was peace of mind. And yet for all their suffering battlefield, medics were vital. They saved lives, crude as their methods were. They pushed the limits of what medicine could do in an era of superstition and guesswork. And they did it with bare hands soaked in blood on fields where angels feared to tread. So, the next time you complain about your job or your office chair being a little squeaky, remember the medic kneeling in the mud, sawing off a leg by torchlight with a battlefield roaring behind him. Now that's a bad day at work, and now having survived blood and bone, let's descend into something colder, darker, and far, far deeper. Imagine the chill of early morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, the air thick with fog, silence broken only by the creak of a wooden cart and the soft shuffle of boots across damp earth. At the center of this scene is a man, gaunt, hunched, face wrapped in cloth, gripping a shovel worn smooth by years of use. He's not a priest, he's not a mourner, he is the grave digger. And in the Middle Ages, his job was less about honoring the dead and more about keeping the living from being overwhelmed by them in a world where death lurked around every corner, famine, war, childbirth, and disease. Someone had to make room for the constant flow of corpses. That someone was the grave digger. And if you think working in sanitation or medicine was rough, wait until you've spent your days and nights digging 6 feet into frozen earth, surrounded by rot rats and the whisper of plague grave. Diggers were usually drawn from the lower classes, men who needed work and had nowhere else to turn. They didn't require formal training or education, just strength, stamina, and the willingness to work in conditions that would make a battlefield medic flinch. The job was straightforward in theory. Dig a hole, put the body in, cover it up. But the reality was far more gruesome. Let's start with the physical challenge. Digging graves by hand in medieval soil wasn't easy. There were no mechanical diggers, no steel spades, just crude iron shovels and calloused hands. In summer, the ground was baked hard. In winter, it froze solid. In wet seasons, the soil turned to sucking mud that clung to every step and made each dig a slow, exhausting ordeal. A single grave could take hours, even days, depending on the conditions. The bodies kept coming during times of plague, like the Black Death in the mid-14th century. Grave diggers worked non-stop, barely able to keep up with the relentless tide of death. One chronicler in London described bodies being piled in carts like meat in a butcher's stall and buried in mass in trenches, sometimes without coffins, prayers, or names. The living couldn't afford ceremony. Survival took priority. These mass graves, known as plague pits, were the stuff of nightmares. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of corpses thrown into long, shallow ditches. Grave diggers would layer the dead like lasagna. Bodies more lime, to speed up decomposition and keep the stench manageable. The smell, however, was never truly avoidable. It clung to the clothes, the skin, the hair. Digging through rot was not only stomach-turning but deadly. See, grave diggers weren't just shoveling earth. They were wading into hotbeds of infection. At a time when people believed in miasma or bad air as the source of disease, graveyards were considered dangerously contaminated zones. And for good reason. Decomposing bodies leaked fluids, attracted swarms of flies, and often carried the very diseases that killed them. In plague years, grave diggers were just as likely to die as the victims they buried. Many tried to protect themselves, wearing long coats soaked in vinegar, stuffing herbs and garlic into their collars, or wrapping their faces in cloth. Some wore the infamous beaked masks, filled with aromatic substances, though these were more common among plague doctors. Still, the efforts were usually futile. Exposure was constant cuts and blisters from digging turned septic. Rats and fleas, the true plague carriers, swarmed the burial sites. A single bite could mean a fever swelling and a swift, agonizing death. Despite the danger, grave diggers weren't revered. In fact, they were often feared and shunned. People believed they were unclean both physically and spiritually. Superstitions claimed that frequent contact with the dead could steal your soul, curse your family, or turn you into something not quite human. Children were told to avoid them. Women crossed the street. Priests performed extra blessings before speaking with them, yet society depended on them. Without grave diggers, cities would have been choked by death. Quite literally, bodies left to rot in the streets attracted wild dogs, disease, and panic. Entire villages were abandoned simply because no one was left to bury the dead. The digger's shovel, as grim as it was, became shield between civilization and complete collapse. And here's where it gets even bleaker. Sometimes the dead weren't quite dead. In plague years, with so many corpses and so little time, people were often buried hastily. Stories abounded of grave diggers hearing screams from beneath the soil. Scratch marks found on the inside of coffins weren't myths. They were grim proof that some were buried alive, unconscious from fear, but still alive enough to wake in the dark. Grave diggers feared these moments, and some carried long poles to jab the corpses just to be sure. Beyond the plague, grave diggers also dealt with war, dead, executions, and suicides, each with their own challenges. Suicides were often buried outside consecrated ground, near crossroads or in unmarked graves, as they were considered damned. Executed criminals might be dissected by surgeons before burial or dumped in remote fields. Grave diggers became unintentional historians of suffering. They saw the wounds, the ropes, the battle scars. They knew the truth about how people lived, and more importantly, how they died. And yet, in some rare cases, grave diggers used their position to survive or even thrive. Some scavenged jewelry or coins from the dead, selling them in back alleys or to black market dealers. Others kept bones or teeth to sell to apothecaries, who believed they had medicinal properties. A few even grew superstitious themselves, wearing rings made from jawbones or carrying bone fragments as protective charms. Morbid, absolutely, but in a world ruled by death, it was just business. Grave digging wasn't always a solo affair. In larger cities, diggers formed guilds or brotherhoods, like the Fraternity of the Holy Grave in parts of Germany, offering mutual support, burials for members, and the occasional pint of ale to drown the misery. These communities offered a sliver of dignity in an otherwise wretched profession. By the late medieval period, graveyards were overflowing. Bones were exhumed and stored in ossuaries, vast bone houses often beneath churches, where thousands of skulls and femurs were stacked in eerie patterns. Grave diggers sometimes managed these as well, becoming keepers of catacombs and crypts. One minute you're digging a pit, the next you're arranging skulls in neat little rows. Despite the filth, the isolation, and the fear, grave diggers held the line. They were the final chapter in every medieval life, from the lowest beggar to the loftiest noble, when all was said and done. Their shovel wrote the last word. So, next time you're in a peaceful cemetery, admiring the trees and the birdsong, spare a thought for the diggers who came before, the men who stared death in the face day after day with nothing but a shovel and a strong stomach. From death, we turn now to fire, smoke, and one of the most painfully ironic careers in history. It's late, the castle above is silent. Its halls are empty, except for flickering torches and the distant clatter of armored boots. But down below, deep in the stone bowels of the keep, the night is just beginning. The door creaks open, revealing chains Racks, thumbscrews, tools neatly arranged on the walls, like a blacksmith's workshop. If the blacksmith made a living from human agony. At the center stands a man sharpening an iron spike. His face is unreadable. He is the torturer, the very embodiment of pain punishment, and perhaps worst of all, duty. When we think about medieval justice, we imagine stern judges, public executions, and village stocks. But behind the scenes, before the trials, before the gallows, there was a darker figure ensuring that. Confessions were made the torturer, and while he worked in darkness, his job was sanctioned, even praised by the law of the land first. Let's clear something up. The medieval torturer wasn't some rogue sadist hiding in a dungeon. In most cases, he was an official employee of the state, hired, trained, and paid to extract confessions, punish crimes, or make examples out of people. He had legal authority. He worked closely with constables, magistrates, and lords. In many towns, he even had a government, issued salary, and yet for all his titles, he was feared, hated, and often left completely alone. Most torturers lived on the outskirts of town, both literally and socially. No one wanted to live near the man who stretched people on racks for a living. Children whispered about him. Parents used his name to scare them into behaving. Even the clergy, who blessed most civil officials, often avoided him. He wasn't evil exactly, he was necessary. And in some ways that was worse. The daily routine of a torturer was as grim as you might imagine. He didn't just randomly hurt people. Everything had to be documented, measured, and controlled, because even pain had rules. In many kingdoms, torture was only allowed under specific conditions, usually after formal charges were made, and often when evidence was strong, but not quite strong enough. And the goal was always the same: a confession. Here, that's the part that's truly maddening. A confession obtained under torture was legally binding. So if you screamed out your guilt while having your fingernails torn off, that counted as a signature. Of course, this led to huge problems. People confessed to crimes they never committed, just to end the pain. Entire families could be destroyed by one tortured sentence. But the system didn't care. Justice was blind and apparently deaf to screams. The torturer's tools were as terrifying as the job itself. The rack is the most infamous, a table where limbs were tied and slowly stretched until joints dislocated and bones cracked. But there was more: thumbscrews, small vices that crushed fingers joint by joint. The heretic's fork, a metal rod placed between the chin and chest, or between the neck and jaw, to stop head movement. The iron boot, a device filled with wedges that were hammered into the shin to splinter the bones. And then there were more subtle tools: hot iron, scalpels, pliers, and devices made to mutilate, not kill. Because torture wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to almost kill. Here's the twisted irony: torturers had to be careful. A dead prisoner couldn't confess, so they trained in anatomy, pain thresholds, and psychological tactics. They knew how long someone could handle pressure on the kneecaps. They could estimate how many turns of the rack a shoulder could take before tearing. They monitored pulse, breathing, and signs of unconsciousness. This wasn't chaos. It was cruelty calculated to the last scream. But did this do to the torturer himself? That's a question rarely asked. But clues remain: letters, journals, fragments of testimony. Many torturers drank heavily, not for fun, but just to sleep at night. Some refused to speak of their work at all. A few left behind writings full of guilt, isolation, and fear. Not fear of punishment, fear of losing their own humanity. One anonymous torturer in 14th century France wrote, "I no longer hear the prayers, only the cracking of joints. My hands smell of blood and burnt flesh. Even after washing, my wife no longer looks at me. My son is afraid, and still I return because the law commands it." And yet, despite all this darkness, the torturer was essential. Inquisition trials, witch hunts, heresy investigations, they all depended on torture to get results. Priests often oversaw these events, but it was the torturer who delivered the confession. If someone admitted to being a witch, The Inquisitor got the credit, but it was the man with the pliers who made it happen in some twisted way. Torturers became part of a performance. Public punishments, whippings, floggings, even executions often needed their help. They were both executioner and stage manager. They sharpened the axe, tied the ropes, held the condemned down while the brand was pressed into flesh, and when the job was over, they went home alone. Maybe the saddest truth is this: many torturers didn't choose the job. They inherited it. The role could be passed from father to son, like a cursed family trade. In some parts of Germany and Italy, torture and executioner roles were considered a profession, passed down for generations, often against the will of the next in line. Imagine being born into a future where your job is to listen to people scream. Then, the laws changed, the Enlightenment came, legal systems modernized, confessions under pain were no longer accepted, torture chambers were shut down. The tools were hidden, then shown in museums. The men who used them, forgotten, buried, without praise or punishment. Just silence. So what can we say about the torturer? Was he a monster, a victim, a necessary evil? Maybe all of those. He lived in the shadows of a brutal system, not because he loved pain, but because pain was policy, because someone in power believed that truth could be forced, and the torturer was the hand that obeyed. And now for our final chapter, we leave the dungeons behind and step into the most dangerous place of all, a medieval kitchen. You might think that working in a castle kitchen, surrounded by roasted meats, fresh bread, and the aroma of herbs would be one of the better jobs in medieval times. But let's be very clear. Being a castle cook wasn't some cozy job with quiet afternoons and recipe experiments. This was brutal, sweat-soaked, stress-filled, and occasionally deadly. A burnt pie could cost you your hands. A spoiled stew could get you executed. Let's start with the setting. Medieval castle kitchens were enormous. Chaotic machines, especially in the homes of wealthy lords, bishops, or royalty. You weren't cooking for a family of 5. You were feeding a small army, nobles, knights, squires, servants, guards, guests, and traveling dignitaries. That meant hundreds of mouths to feed every single day, and during banquets, feast days, and weddings, that number could double or triple overnight. While a feast might last a few hours, the preparation took days, sometimes even weeks. Massive stews, whole roasted boars, pies the size of wagon wheels, pastries shaped like swans. Medieval nobles loved their meals grand, grotesque, and theatrical. Cooks didn't just feed, they performed. Every dish was a reflection of the lord's wealth and status, and that meant zero room for error. The castle cook was the general of a fiery, chaotic army: potboys, spit turners, bread makers, sauce stirrers, meat preppers, pastry folders, fire keepers. The kitchen was hotter than a blacksmith's forge. Open flames roared from massive hearths. Boiling pots hung from soot-covered hooks. Smoke filled every corner. There was no ventilation. Think of it like cooking inside a furnace while being screamed at to move faster. Food safety not in this century. Raw meat was stored underground, often swarming with flies. Fish arrived in barrels of salt or half-rotting milk, spoiled by midday. Eggs turned bad in hours. Yet everything had to be used. Wasting food was not tolerated. The cook had to guess what was still edible, and if something went wrong, it wasn't the pig that got punished. It was you. Let's talk about the stakes. Undercooked food. You might get whipped, burnt bread, public flogging. If a lord or guest got sick from your meal, even by accident, things turned deadly. Some cooks were thrown in dungeons. Others were executed on suspicion of poisoning. One infamous case from 13th century France. A cook was boiled alive in the same pot he used for soup. Nobles didn't expect perfection. They demanded it, but cooks also had to be careful. Too much spice. You could be accused of sorcery. Use an unusual ingredient, poison. Change a recipe without permission, treason. It was like being a master chef, a chemist, and a courtier all at once, without the safety of any of those jobs. Now, Let's not forget the spit boys, the youngest and unluckiest kitchen workers. Their jobs sit beside the fire turning giant spits of roasting meat for hours. No gloves, no rest, just a child sweating and blinking through smoke, slowly roasting. Next to the roast, many suffered burns, eye damage, or collapsed from exhaustion. If they stopped turning even for a second, the meat burned and the cook got punished. Burns were everywhere: hot oil, boiling water, open flames, heavy iron pots. The kitchen was a medieval war zone. No first aid, no burn cream. You got hurt. You kept working. Infection. Wrap a dirty rag around it. Blood in the soup. Stir harder. This was a place where knives slipped, fingers were lost. People died. One wrong move near a boiling cauldron and your life could end instantly, even if you were skilled, fast, and lucky enough to avoid injury or death. Kitchen politics could still ruin you. Servants gossiped, knights complained, nobles were suspicious. If someone said you used unclean meat or forgot to bless the bread, your reputation could be destroyed. The cook served the stomachs of the rich, but lived at their mercy still. Some cooks rose through the ranks. A few became legends, known not just for their meals, but for their strategy. A talented cook could gain a lord's favor, hire his own staff, even advise on state banquets. Some were given land titles and wealth, but always with one condition: stay useful or be replaced. Now about the food. Yes, it was elaborate, but not always delicious. Many medieval dishes were designed for spectacle, not flavor. Meat pies with live birds, bread shaped like castles. Stews dyed with crushed flowers. Spices like saffron, nutmeg, and cinnamon were status symbols. The more you used, the richer your lord looked, but the balance had to be perfect. Too little, you looked cheap. Too much, you wasted gold. Either way, you risked punishment. Then came the banquets, the Super Bowl of castle kitchens. Preparations started weeks in advance. The kitchen became a battlefield. Whole oxen roasted, sugared peacocks, sewn back into their feathers, and served as art. It wasn't enough to feed the guests. You had to amaze them. The pressure was so intense. Some cooks collapsed during the feast. Others drank, just to survive the stress. Still, through the heat, the blood, the danger, castle cooks were essential. They kept the castle alive. They turned raw, spoiled ingredients into meals that upheld the illusion of order and power. If the cook failed, the household failed. That made him both critical and completely replaceable. So next time your toast burns, or your soup is too salty, or your oven takes too long to heat up, remember the castle cook, sweating beside a roaring fire, surrounded by blades, while nobles screamed for dinner, and a 10-year-old fainted by the fire pit. And remember, one spoiled rabbit stew could land your body in that stew pot. Instead, were 6 of the worst jobs in medieval life, each more horrifying and more vital than the last. They kept castles running, armies fed, nobles pleased, and society from falling apart, even if it meant bleeding, burning, or being buried along the way.